If you were sailing on the Mediterranean Sea in the 16th century, enjoying the fresh salt air and the warm sun, the wind would occasionally change. Suddenly, a smell would hit you. It was a stench so powerful, so thick and vile, that sailors on passing ships would gag and desperately cover their faces with vinegar-soaked rags. It was a physical wall of rot, a nauseating cocktail of decomposing meat, old sweat, advanced disease, and human waste. That smell meant one thing: a war galley was approaching. We often romanticize life at sea, thinking of pirates and adventure, but for hundreds of thousands of men, the Mediterranean was no paradise. It was a prison without walls, a floating coffin designed to squeeze every ounce of energy out of a human being until he broke. To understand the horror of the galley, you first have to understand the machine. A war galley was a masterpiece of naval engineering, long and sleek, designed to ram enemy ships at high speed, but it had a fundamental flaw. It needed an engine. In the 16th and 17th centuries, that engine was made of meat and bone. Imagine a wooden plank about 4 feet long and covered in rough burlap. Now, imagine living on that plank for 24 hours a day for months at a time. You are chained to it by your ankle with a heavy iron shackle. You are sitting next to 4 or 5 other men, packed so tight that your elbows touch and your sweat mixes together. You cannot leave this bench. You eat here, you sleep here, and you suffer here. The first thing that broke a man was the sleep deprivation. Because the bench was so crowded, you could not lie down. You had to sleep sitting up, usually leaning on the back of the man in front of you, while the man behind you leaned on you. If he had a fever, you felt it. If he had lice, they crawled onto you. It was a human centipede of misery that never ended. The real nightmare, however, was the hygiene. Because you were chained, you could not go to a toilet. There were no toilets. When nature called, you went right there where you sat. The waste would run down the slanted bench, pooling in the center of the ship, down in the bilge. The iconic galley stench wasn't just body odor. It was a toxic cloud of ammonia and methane that fermented in the heat of the Mediterranean sun. The fumes were often so toxic that men would pass out from the vapors alone. This filth bred a zoo of parasites. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs were your constant companions, but the rats were the boldest. They would scurry over your legs while you tried to sleep, biting at open sores. If the man next to you died during the night, the overseers wouldn't bother to unlock him until the morning roll call. You would spend the entire night chained to a cooling corpse, unable to move away. Saltwater boils covered your skin from the constant spray, and the friction of the wooden bench against your wet clothes stripped the skin off your backside. A condition called galley rot would set in, gangrene eating away at your flesh while you were still alive and rowing. But you weren't there to suffer. You were there to provide power. The rowing was a violent, full-body convulsion. The oar was a massive tree trunk, 12 meters long and weighing hundreds of pounds. It took 5 or 6 men to pull just one oar. The stroke was brutal. You didn't just pull with your arms. You had to stand up on the bench, lift the heavy handle high above your chest, plunge it into the water, and then throw your entire body weight backward, falling onto the seat to drag the blade through the sea. Stand up, lift, fall back, thousands of times a day. If you slipped, the massive wooden handle would snap back and shatter your teeth or break your ribs. If you fell out of rhythm, the oar behind you would crash into your spine. To keep the timing, a man called the comité walked up and down the center gangway. He carried a whistle and a bullwhip made of dried bull hide. He didn't use the whip just to punish. He used it to keep the tempo. If you slowed down or collapsed, he hit you. The scars on a slave's back were like a map of his torture. The fuel for this human engine was pathetic. Hardtack biscuits infested with weevils and a soup made of beans and oil. The water in the barrels would turn green with algae, forced down only with the help of vinegar. During a chase, the comité would put a piece of bread soaked in wine into your mouth. This wasn't kindness. It was chemical fuel to keep you from passing out. Some chases lasted for 20 hours straight. Men would die of heart failure right on the bench. When they slumped over, the overseer would simply unlock the shackle and throw the body overboard to feed the sharks. When the ship wasn't sailing during the winter months, the slaves stayed on the damp, freezing ship in the harbor. The cold was biting, and with only a thin cloak, many lost toes to frostbite. To survive, they turned the galley into a floating sweatshop, knitting stockings to sell to people on the docks just to buy a little extra food. But the worst moment for a galley slave was combat. When two galleys smashed into each other, the enemy ram would snap the oars like toothpicks. If an oar handle hit you as it snapped, it would take your head off. While soldiers fought on the top deck, you were helpless below, chained to the ship. If the ship began to sink, the officers would jump off to save themselves, but you couldn't jump. The keys to your shackles were with the overseer, who was already gone. Imagine the water rising around your chest, 5 men struggling against one chain in the dark, as the ship dragged you to the bottom of the ocean. Thousands of slaves drowned this way, still attached to the bench when the ship hit the sea floor. Historians talk about the brilliant admirals and the strategy of battles like Lepanto, but they rarely talk about the smell or the muscle that moved those ships. They rarely talk about the thousands of anonymous men, criminals, prisoners of war, or unlucky souls who were forced to fuel the war machines of empires. The galley was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was powered by the absolute limit of human misery. The physical degradation was only half of the story. The psychological toll of being reduced to a biological component of a machine was what truly destroyed a man. You lost your name. You were simply a number or a position on a bench. You lost your humanity as you were forced to live in your own filth. The constant roar of the sea, the rhythmic thumping of the oars, and the piercing whistle of the comité became the soundtrack to your slow descent into madness. Many men simply gave up, their eyes becoming hollow and vacant, their bodies continuing to move in the rowing motion even after their minds had fled. The legal systems of the time used the galleys as a convenient way to dispose of people. In France, the slaves included not just violent criminals, but also those whose only crime was their faith. In the Ottoman Empire, Christian prisoners of war were the primary fuel for the fleet. Regardless of their background, once they were shackled to that bench, their previous lives evaporated. They became part of a collective, a singular organism of pain. The engineering of the oars themselves added to the suffering. These oars were unbalanced and massive. The physical force required to lift the blade out of the water after a stroke was monumental. This constant lifting and plunging action destroyed the rotator cuffs and lower backs of the slaves within months. Hernias were universal. If a slave developed a hernia so large it interfered with his rowing, the surgeons would sometimes perform a crude operation on the deck, only to chain the man back to his bench a few days later. The diet was also insufficient in calories. A man rowing a galley could burn between 4,000 and 6,000 calories a day during intense activity. The rations provided barely half of that. This led to the body literally consuming its own muscle tissue to keep the heart beating. By the end of a long campaign, the slaves looked like living skeletons, their skin stretched tight over bone, their ribs protruding like the very oars they pulled. The psychological impact of seeing your own body waste away while being forced to perform superhuman labor is something modern minds can barely grasp. There was no hope of escape, no possibility of rebellion when you were chained to 4 other men who were just as weak as you. The only thing that kept you moving was the fear of the whip and the instinct to survive one more hour. When you look at the blue waters of the Mediterranean today, it's hard to imagine that beneath those waves lies a graveyard of hundreds of thousands of men who died in chains. The galleys eventually disappeared, replaced by sailing ships and later by steam. But the legacy of the floating hell remains a dark chapter in history. It serves as a reminder of what happens when the drive for power and efficiency completely strips away the value of a human life. The galley was not just a ship. It was a testament to human cruelty and the lengths to which empires would go to dominate the seas. Every stroke of the oar was a cry of pain that went unheard by the admirals on the sun-drenched decks above. So, if you think your job is hard, if your commute is frustrating, or if you feel trapped by your daily responsibilities, just take a breath. Remember that you can stand up, you can walk away. You aren't breathing the toxic air of a bilge, waiting for the crack of a bullwhip to tell you when to move. You aren't chained to a cooling corpse in the dark, watching the water rise as your ship slips beneath the waves. You are not a replaceable battery in a machine made of bone. On a medieval galley, the only true freedom was the moment your heart finally stopped and you were released into the cold embrace of the sea. The horizon was never a promise of a new land for the slave. It was only a measure of how many thousands of strokes remained before the sun went down and the cold of the night took over. History is written by the victors who stood on the decks, but the reality of the past was forged by the men who suffered beneath them, their lives measured in the bitter rhythm of the oar.